Continuing with the Nauts, if anyone entered the sea, the Nauts had a reputation over generations of quickly destroying those who would enter the sea. Um, and since this occurred over nations, it became their craft. They became very good at naval domination over the centuries. In the view of the Nauts, they were protecting the sacred chain sea and the forbidden isles of the chosen people of the chain. But to everyone else, they were obviously pirates. Um, and out of this piracy or protectionism, depending on your political bend, a faction eventually rose, or a splinter group eventually arose out of this well-oiled machine of nautical hegemony, who accepted the reality of these vices, and they called themselves the Landeds. They were led by a pirate king named Leone, uh, to which he called all those in his employ, that is to say, the other Landeds, his, quote, dead armada. The dead armada turned their heritage of naval prowess onto their own people, seizing nearly half of the Nauts' fleet in short order. Something of a surprise attack, guerrilla warfare. They weren't expecting their own tactics to be used against them. Afterwards, after this seizing, the dead armada began to raid the lands of the world, causing terror for everyone within the embrace. However, the dead armada did not change their flags while they pillaged. This made everyone in the world think it was Nauts conducting such terror. The Landeds understood the value of shock and awe, of fear. They came by sea, night, and day, randomly, and made it a point to use this fear, as their weapon. In fact, there are still accounts today etched in the history tomes of people surviving raids who said that these dead armada were not men and women, but sea monsters come to wreak revenge on the folly of those who left the chain for these islands, for land. Capitalizing on this fear, Pirate King Leone gave into its power and began to eat people. He then became known as the Cannibal Pirate King Leone, the Cannibal King. He and the Dead Armada attacked everything and everyone until they were finally defeated by the Nauts at the largest Forbidden Isle, south of the Great Chain, which is also the place where the Dead Armada had its base of operations. This isle is called Siren Song. Similar to the War of the Two Popes, so too were the Landeds killed or exiled from the sea. Similarly as well, no one else knows exactly what happened to the Cannibal King, Leone. Much effort has been expended by the Nauts and other parties alike to make sure that the Cannibal King's name fades, or has faded, into the bedtime stories and nightmare. However, he was a very real person. After the Battle of Siren Song and defeating the Dead Armada, the Nauts raced to develop their military prowess, but as I mentioned before, they ultimately fell behind the Imperium after the Imperium recovered under Pope Ephraim's leadership and in the power of his legendary student circle. And therefore, the Great War became a paradigm change for modernity, in that the Great War became about which of the two superpowers, that being the Imperium and the Builders, as such, would win. Beaten and bruised, the Nauts tactically decided to retreat to the Temple of the Chain. They brought all their ships in. They made this great defensive bulwark out of the remaining material prowess that they had left after half their fleet gone from fighting the Cannibal King. And once they shelled up, they made a great effort of exclaiming that they were neutral, now that they had always been neutral, and that they sent out envoys of peace from the Temple of the Chain, calling for an end to the Great War, which at this point had been going on near to 30 years. Um, Now let's talk about the Order of the Emerald Moon during the Great War. The Order had always been more or less neutral in international affairs, even though territorially either the Emerald or the Moon is in more or less parlay with the main faction in their region. It's just a reality of coordinating with them for funding such that they can perform effective demon quarantining or containment procedures or hunting. As such, during the Great War, life was simpler but more perilous for the Order. Stop the demons, keep them from entering the embrace, or overrunning it specifically. And during this Great War, the Order kept to its charter, despite being regionally bound to one faction over the other. As such, the great nations, in their bloodlusting bellicosity and arrogance, significantly dampened or took away their funding from the Order, a price that the Order had to pay for their neutrality. Um, and as such, that money that the great nations took away from funding the Order, they reinvested in their war efforts. Eventually, the price was paid in the near extinction of the Order, both the Emerald and the Moon, the Order as a whole, that is to say, and thus the threat of demons rose exponentially, and more of them bred, and there were more demons in the Unlinked. So what you have is essentially on one side of the world, near the chain, the Great War waged as two superpowers were trying to lock horns. On the other side of the world, where demons roam, the spread thin and underfunded Order, which was just conducting its neutral duty to keep the demons from overrunning society, was not doing so well. They were fighting for the potential of survival so that the great nations could play their war games with each other. And while the Order are composed of incredible elite fighters, there are always going to be few relative to other military units in the world. These demon hunters, they're very valuable, but they're very rare. The Order all this time sent out pleas for funding and for new recruits, but it all fell on deaf ears, of course, because the war-obsessed nations had their eyes turned towards fighting their neighbors. So what does this all come to? Well, a few things which concluded the 30 Years' War. Depending on who you ask, the war was about the outgrowth of nations who could not control unsavory elements internally and were forced into war with foreign nations, therefore, as a result of those elements' unruly activities. Some would say that this was always going to be the consequence of nations who refused to work together in the grander plight of the chain's embrace. But whatever the correct interpretation, if there even is one of the war, it cannot be denied that at a certain point, too many lay dead. That is to say, that at about a specific point near the end of the war, more of our sons and daughters were being buried in the ground than being born into the world. And so what this really manifested to was a fatigue in neglecting funding and strengthening the Order and their defensive wall against the demons. And as such, that dam broke, and a great torrent of demons flooded into society, into the embrace. And this is what is referred to as the Great Scourge. Interestingly, there's some providence, I suppose, in this event, in that just when the builders had grown to their greatest height, the apex of their technological ability to wage war with terrible weapons, as distributed, careless as they may be in the other war-torn and privately interested parts of the world, so too were the Imperium at the height of their powers. Pope Ephraim Borgia and his circle of legendary new and mysteriously new magic users, where they had conquered territory and they were the height of their powers and their ability to wage war, where the world was careening towards destruction itself because the two superpowers were basically about to destroy the world to fight each other. The Great Scourge happened at that point. And the Great Scourge was a more obviously greater threat, an existential terror for survival, than was their political conflicts with each other. So they did what you have to do in that situation. They joined forces, fully equipped to fight. They were successful, very luckily. But they were successful, essentially enacting a demon cull with their built-up war materials, such that the demons' number, the population of the demons, which overran the embrace from the unlinked, were thinned out and then therefore recontained within the unlinked lands once again. A project which, ironically, all their ancestors had done before. That is to say, they cooperated in a collective security threat, even when they were less advanced and they were more tribal. And this theme of history and of lineage has become a mode of consternation amongst all civilized peoples, an aspect of embarrassment, and to a lesson to avoid greed and hubris. As such, it was at this moment of being able to breathe after the demons were pushed back that the continuing call from the Nauts to end the war of their neutrality started to actually ring in the ears of these nations. And such, all three great nations then met at the Temple of the Chain and created what is now called the Spool. And similar to how a spool is the repository for a chain, so too did the nations become bound to one another. Therefore, the Spool became the heart of international politics. It created a ceasefire, which we are now under, which has lasted for the last 20 years. It also ensured the permanent funding of the Order and the Confiscation Force, or the CF, which in the last video was mentioned as an international policing effort to hunt down illegal builders' weapons tech that were built up during the war and distributed by the noble families and potentially even bought by non-builder nation factions to wage war at any cost. And so since then, the embrace has known historical peace for the last 20 years. Though the world today knows this peace, there are interestingly also now children who have been born and who are coming of age today who know nothing of the world as it was before the Spool. As such, though we are bound as that chain is to the Spool, however, also too, peace hangs by a thread rather than by a strongly linked chain, because new and destabilizing elements from this new and attempt to stabilize world order have grown. That is to say, Osiris-Seth, the extreme offshoot of the Imperium, and Durandal, the extreme offshoot of the Builders using weapons, were born in the ashes of this new world order and are required to be contained by the cooperative efforts, such as the demons were contained by cooperative effort in the war. And they threaten this peace by outbreak, by catalyzing war again, or such that they distract us that we cannot sufficiently invest in demons. In a major and there's a single notable heroic figure who rose publicly out of this in a major commitment to world peace. A woman named Luta Boomshot, who is still currently actually the Builders Artillerist Supreme, who during the war was the fist of the Builders, who smashed through her destructive genius and prowess every single front of enemy line during the war with amazingly engineered weapons. She single-handedly oversaw the disarmament of the Great War's most devastating weapons, many of which she built herself. So she flipped. She's a hero for those who support the Spool and international order, but she's also an icon of oppression by those who feel their necks too tightly wound by the chain of the Spool. So that's the Great War, which happened 30 years ago. Happened 20 years ago and raged on for 30 years. And so your characters in the world, depending on how old they are and where they were during that time, may have very different perspectives and opinions on the Spool, or that is to say, the UN, and what's going on with international peace efforts, the demon hunting guild of the order, and potentially how you feel about necessary law of international society getting its feet in what some may say making the world a better place and maintaining order, which others may say, you know what, though the demon threat was there, maybe we would have been better off if one of the nations rose to ascendancy and took control. That's for your characters to decide, and it will be really fun to see how we all play with these ideas in the factional conflict of the campaign and in your personal quests and in dealing with the demons. So, in review, all these factions had different reasons for going to war and had different reasons for calling for peace. The demon threat was constant, and there's a new world order which your character will have a different perspective on depending on their age. Yeah, that's it.